All right, we're in Titus chapter 3, and there's only one question. Why does Paul say we should not speak evil of or slander anyone? I'll read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 3. Remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good, to slander no one, to be peaceable and considerate, and to show true humility toward all men. In writing to Titus, he's instructing him the things that he should remind the Christians of. And among these things is that they should slander no one, right there in the beginning of verse 2. And instead of slandering or speaking evil of others, they ought to be peaceable and considerate, and they ought to show true humility. The reason is given in the very next verse. Because at one time, we too were foolish, disobedient, deceived, and enslaved by all kinds of passions and pleasures. We lived in malice and envy, being hated and hating one another. The reason that we should bite our tongue, that we should not even think negatively or critically or slanderously towards others, is because we ought to remember that we too were once like them. We too were once foolish, disobedient, deceived, and enslaved by all kinds of passions and lusts. And not only should we remember that we once were there, we should also remember that even today, maybe not to the degree that we once were, maybe not to the degree that others are, but even today, we find ourselves doing things that are foolish, or at least thinking things that are foolish. We find ourselves doing things or being tempted or drawn away to do things that are disobedient. We find ourselves deceived. We find ourselves drawn by passions and lusts. And so realizing how similar we are to these other individuals ought to help us in biting our tongue so that we don't speak slanderously, don't speak evil of any others. In addition to this, Paul says that in verse 4 and 5, but when the kindness and love of God our Savior appeared, he saved us, not because of righteous things we had done, but because of his mercy. And so here is the suggestion, the implication that we ought to be imitating that same mercy that we have received, we ought to be showing to others. And so just as God has overlooked and has forgiven us and pardoned us of our deceptions, of our disobedience, of our foolish behavior, we also ought to have this same attitude towards others. So what does this mean? Does this mean then that we're not supposed to say anything critical or negative about anyone? Does it mean that we're not supposed to even think critical if people are doing something that's wrong? Well, no, I think the example Paul gives is very helpful and gives us a good, solid rule by which we can lead our lives in this area. He says we should remember how we were. And when we were foolish, when we were disobedient, when we were deceived, and when we still are these things today, I'm sure you don't believe that no one should say anything negative to you. I'm sure you don't believe that no one should say anything critical. But what's important is why they're saying the thing negative, why they're saying the thing critical, and how, of course, they're saying those things. It has been helpful to me when I've done foolish things or been about to do foolish things, or when I've been disobedient or when I've been deceived. It's been helpful to me when people came to me critically and challenged some of my ways of thinking or some of my actions. Many times I don't acknowledge it right at the point, and I give some kind of explanation and try to justify myself. But later, by the grace of God, I'm able to be convicted and acknowledge many times where I have been wrong. That's speaking evil, we would say, speaking negatively. But it's how it's being done and why it's being done. And I think also that can be a rule for us. If we are going to say something negative, going to say something critical to another individual about someone or to the individual, him or herself, the rule that we can guide, how would I want this said about me? How would I want this said about me when I'm being foolish, deceived, disobedient, or one of the others? And using that as a rule can help us guide and avoid inappropriately speaking negatively or slanderously about others.